The buzzing fluorescent lights cast a cold, unforgiving glare over the police station. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and the low murmur of conversation filled the air. In the middle of the chaos, an 8-year-old black boy named Marcus sat alone on a cracked plastic bench. His small fingers clutched tightly around an old, worn dog tag hanging from his neck, the metal catching the light every time his thumb brushed across the faded engraving. Across the room, Officer Briggs leaned casually against the front desk, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. He was a stocky man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes and a tone that dripped with casual authority. "Your daddy was a hero, huh?" "Sure, kid," Briggs called out, loud enough for the whole waiting room to hear. A few civilians nearby chuckled, and even the desk clerk gave a slight shake of his head, trying to hide his grin. It wasn't the first time someone made up a story to feel important in this place. To them, Marcus was just another kid from the wrong side of town with too much imagination. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply held the dog tag tighter, his small knuckles whitening with the effort. His dark eyes stayed locked on the floor, his lips pressed together in a firm line. The humiliation hung heavy in the air, but he carried it alone, shoulders squared, refusing to let the sting show. Across the lobby, a janitor paused mid-mop. An older black man with a slight limp and weathered hands, he stood silently, his gaze lingering on Marcus. His mop bucket sat forgotten as he watched the scene unfold, a deep, unreadable emotion flickering in his eyes. "You know, kid," Briggs continued, shaking his head, "everyone's a war hero when they're deadbeat enough to leave behind a piece of metal and a story." Another laugh rippled through the room. This time it cut deeper, sharp like a knife through already bruised skin. Marcus blinked slowly, his grip tightening once more on the dog tag. His mother, Denise, was at the front desk, still filling out paperwork for the robbery they had suffered just hours earlier. Her body stiffened slightly at the sound of the laughter, but she didn't turn around. She knew better. She knew how quickly speaking up could turn a bad situation into a dangerous one. The janitor shifted his weight, setting his mop quietly against the wall. His weathered hand dipped into the pocket of his overalls, fingers wrapping around a battered old flip phone. He didn't make a move yet, just watched, listened, waited. Marcus stayed silent, enduring the quiet humiliation like a soldier bracing against a storm. His mind wasn't on the officer's words. It wasn't even on the laughter. It was on the weight of the metal pressing against his palm, the last piece he had left of a father who had once knelt by his bed and told him that real strength didn't always roar. "Sometimes," it whispered. The station doors creaked against their hinges, the old metal moaning under a gust of wind. Conversations faltered. Officer Briggs glanced over his shoulder, annoyed. But seeing no one immediately entering, he turned back to his paperwork, muttering under his breath. The janitor's eyes narrowed. He shifted again, almost imperceptibly, the tension coiling through his body like a spring ready to snap. Marcus sat there, a tiny figure in a too big world, the sound of laughter still echoing faintly in his ears. The tag grew warm against his skin from his tight grip, but he didn't let go. He wouldn't. Somewhere beyond the fluorescent lights and the buzzing phones, something had started moving. Something unseen. Something heavy with the weight of memory and respect. The janitor pulled out his phone fully now, his thumb hovering over a number he hadn't dialed in years. He pressed it and waited. Inside, the tension thickened like fog before a storm. No one in that room knew it yet, but they were about to learn the kind of story that didn't need defending. They were about to meet a truth that would silence every laugh, wipe every smirk off their faces, and make them stand a little straighter without even knowing why. They were about to learn exactly who Marcus's father really was. The chair Marcus sat on creaked slightly as he shifted his weight, the plastic cold against his small frame. His eyes remained locked on the floor, but his mind wandered far from the harsh, buzzing lights and cold laughter that filled the station. He remembered his father's voice, calm and steady, telling him bedtime stories that weren't just about dragons and castles, but about real heroes. About men who didn't need medals or parades to prove their worth. About standing tall even when the world tried to bend you low. His father had always said, "Courage, son, isn't about being loud. It's about staying steady when everything around you tries to break you." Marcus rubbed the dog tag between his fingers, feeling the tiny grooves of the name stamped into the metal. Marcus King Sr., his hero, his best friend, his teacher. Gone too soon, but never far from his heart. At the front desk, Denise's voice quivered slightly as she finished giving the details of the break-in. "They took the television, my laptop, everything they could carry," she said. "But thank God Marcus wasn't home. That's what matters." The officer behind the desk barely nodded, tapping keys on his computer with mechanical disinterest. No sympathy, no warmth, just another report, another poor family complaining about something that wouldn't make the news. Denise clutched her purse tighter, swallowing the familiar lump rising in her throat. She had learned long ago that for some people, their pain didn't warrant attention. Behind her, Officer Briggs chuckled quietly with a fellow officer, still shooting occasional glances at Marcus. To them, the boy wasn't anything special. Just another black kid holding on to a fantasy. Marcus didn't hear the words, but he felt the weight of them. Heavy, invisible, pressing down on him harder than any physical blow. Still, he didn't cry. He didn't argue. He remembered what his father had taught him. Dignity wasn't about what others saw. It was about what you carried inside, even when no one else understood it. Across the room, the janitor leaned against his mop, one hand still gripping the battered flip phone in his pocket. His weathered face was tight with thought. He had seen men like Officer Briggs before, heard those same tired laughs, watched those same dismissive sneers, and too often he had watched brave stories be buried under a mountain of silence. Not today. Marcus glanced up, just for a moment, and their eyes met, the boy and the janitor. There was no exchange of words, no nod of understanding, but something passed between them. Recognition, respect, a silent promise that someone saw him, that someone believed him. The boy dropped his gaze again, his thumb still tracing the letters on the dog tag. In his mind, he could hear his father's laugh, deep and booming, the way it used to fill the small apartment. He could feel the rough fabric of his father's fatigues when he scooped him up after a long day. He could smell the faint scent of motor oil and sun-warmed leather that always clung to his jacket. For a moment, the noise of the police station faded. The harsh voices, the ringing phones, the cold stares, all of it disappeared, replaced by memories that wrapped around Marcus like armor. Denise finished at the desk and turned, catching sight of her son sitting so still, so small, yet somehow so strong. She felt her heart ache with pride and sorrow all at once. She crossed the room quickly, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come here, baby," she whispered. Marcus stood, his hand never leaving the dog tag, and followed his mother to a quieter bench along the wall. She sat down first, pulling him close into the curve of her arm. Marcus leaned into her without a word, resting his head against her side. Behind them, Officer Briggs barked a laugh at some joke, oblivious to the quiet strength building at the other end of the room, oblivious to the shift already beginning, subtle as the first rumble of distant thunder. The janitor finally moved, his hand slipping the flip phone free from his pocket. He stepped out through a side door into the chill evening air. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "This is Johnson," the janitor said quietly. "We've got a situation." Inside, the police station buzzed on, unaware. But outside, gears had begun to turn. Gears heavy with history, heavy with honor. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of his father's memories settle over him. He didn't know what was coming, but deep down, something told him that soon, the world would remember who Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr. really was. And this time, nobody would laugh. Officer Briggs leaned against the desk, flipping through a file with exaggerated boredom. His voice carried easily across the waiting area, designed less to communicate and more to be heard by everyone. "Kids like that," he said, tossing his chin toward Marcus, "they all got some sob story. Daddy's a war hero. Mama's a queen. Always some fantasy, when reality's a busted apartment and a missing TV." A few snickers echoed from the officers nearby. Civilians waiting for their own paperwork to be processed glanced at Marcus with thinly veiled amusement or mild annoyance. Nobody spoke up. Nobody cared. Marcus heard every word, but he stayed where he was, small and still, his mother's arm protectively around him. Denise tightened her hold on him for a moment, feeling the heat rise in her face. But she knew better. Words against badges didn't win battles in rooms like this. Officer Briggs wasn't finished. He sauntered a few steps closer, the floor creaking beneath his heavy boots. He crouched slightly to Marcus's level, the smirk never leaving his face. "So, kid," he said, loud enough that even the clerk pretending not to listen had to hear, "what was your old man? A janitor, too? Bet he left you more bills than medals." The laughter was cruel this time, sharper. Denise flinched, but kept her eyes down, praying for patience she didn't feel. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He simply shifted his grip on the dog tag, squeezing the cool metal until it bit into his palm. His chest rose and fell slowly, like he was holding something down deep inside that refused to be broken. Officer Briggs chuckled, standing up and patting the boy's head roughly, as if mocking even the idea of affection. He turned back to the desk, shaking his head. "Can't save 'em all," he muttered. The sound of a soft mop swishing against the floor resumed somewhere behind the waiting area. The janitor, Johnson, moved slowly but purposefully, his eyes never straying far from Marcus, and the officer who thought mocking a child was sport. In a side hallway, Johnson ducked briefly into a maintenance closet. From the shadows, he pulled out his flip phone again. This time, his fingers moved fast over the keypad. Across town, a phone buzzed on a polished oak desk. Inside the station, time crawled. Marcus sat motionless, absorbing every snide glance, every cruel whisper, every dismissive snort, like blows he refused to show hurt him. His mother whispered words of comfort he could barely hear over the pounding in his ears. "You have to be strong," he told himself. "Strong like Dad." A door slammed somewhere in the station, and a group of new officers filed through, their laughter dying off when they noticed the tension in the waiting room. Even they could feel the heaviness that clung to the air now. A feeling that something had shifted. A storm gathering strength just out of sight. Officer Briggs returned to his paperwork, occasionally sneaking glances at the boy he'd tried to humiliate, but Marcus never looked up. He didn't need to. Johnson emerged from the closet, mop back in hand, and began moving slowly toward the front entrance. His expression was unreadable, but every step he took seemed heavier, more deliberate. Outside, unseen through the cloudy glass of the station doors, black SUVs rolled up quietly. Engines idled for a moment, then shut off. Boots hit the pavement. Heavy, deliberate steps. Inside, Officer Briggs continued his conversation at the desk, laughing about a fishing trip he was planning, completely unaware that the mood in the room had shifted from dismissive to uneasy. Marcus straightened slightly in his seat. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it, like a ripple in the air, a vibration in the ground. Something was coming. The janitor reached the lobby doors just as they pushed open from the outside. A gust of cold air blew through the station, scattering papers and setting the overhead lights to a slight flicker. Conversation froze mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the entrance. Through the open doors stepped a man in full military dress uniform, the rows of medals and ribbons on his chest gleaming under the harsh lights. His skin was dark and proud, his posture straight as a rifle, his expression carved from stone. The general's boots struck the tile floor with sharp, echoing steps that seemed to shake the walls themselves. He walked with the easy authority of someone who had commanded battlefields, who had led men into fire and brought them back alive. He didn't look at the front desk. He didn't acknowledge the officers staring at him in stunned silence. His eyes, cold and clear, locked immediately onto Marcus. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The general crossed the lobby in 7 precise steps, coming to a halt exactly 3 feet in front of Marcus. The room was so silent now that the buzzing of the fluorescent lights sounded deafening. And then, before anyone could even process it, the general raised his hand to his brow and rendered a perfect, crisp salute. Marcus stared, wide-eyed, the dog tag trembling slightly in his hand. Officer Briggs gawked, frozen halfway through reaching for a coffee cup he now seemed to have forgotten. The general's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, slicing through the heavy air. "Young man," he said, "Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr. wasn't just a hero. He was a legend." The floor might as well have cracked open under Officer Briggs's feet. Marcus, still gripping the tag, looked up into the general's eyes. And for the first time in hours, the boy's lips parted slightly, not in fear, not in shame, but in something deeper. Recognition. The general's salute stayed firm for a full breath longer before he slowly lowered his hand. His movements were precise, controlled, filled with the kind of discipline that didn't need words to announce itself. Marcus stumbled to his feet, unsure what to do, but driven by something older than etiquette. A pull, like gravity, to stand and meet the honor offered to him. The general bent slightly, reaching out his hand. Marcus stared at it for a moment, the worn dog tag still clutched tight in his own. Then he reached out and shook the general's hand, his small fingers swallowed in the firm, steady grasp. Officer Briggs didn't move, couldn't move. His jaw tightened as he watched, the smirk long gone, replaced by something sour and ugly twisting his face. The general turned slightly, raising his voice just enough that it carried across the silent room without shouting. Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr. wasn't just a soldier. He was the man who taught soldiers how to lead. He trained the men you now salute without question. He shaped the commanders you fear and respect. A ripple went through the officers standing nearby. Names flickered through their minds, generals whose commands they'd memorized, battle legends whispered about in training academies. The general wasn't finished. "I served under him," he continued, And I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for that man." Marcus felt his mother's hand find his shoulder, steady and trembling all at once. She didn't speak. Her face said everything her voice couldn't. The general turned back to Marcus, his eyes softening. "Your father," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "was the man others followed into fire, because they knew he would bring them home." A lump rose in Marcus's throat, but he swallowed it down. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Stand tall, son. Always." Across the room, one of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Briggs, whose face had gone pale. The general wasn't done making his point. He stepped aside and reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, pulling out a carefully folded photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. With great care, he unfolded it on the bench next to Marcus. It showed 30 soldiers in formation, their faces serious, their bodies lean and ready. And at the center, slightly apart from the others, stood a tall man with dark skin, 3 stripes and a rocker on his sleeve. His face was strong, proud, and unmistakably familiar. Marcus reached out with trembling fingers, touching the image like he could pull it into the present. "That's him," Marcus whispered. "Yes," the general said, his voice carrying a note of deep reverence. "Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr., front and center, as always." Around them, the station seemed to hold its breath. Officers who had laughed earlier now stood frozen, their faces stiff and unreadable. Officer Briggs shifted back a step, bumping into the desk behind him. His bravado had evaporated like morning mist under a rising sun. The general turned toward the room, his voice dropping into a quiet, commanding tone that somehow filled every corner. "This man," he said, gesturing to the photo, "refused evacuation after an explosion ripped through our training grounds. He carried 3 men half a mile to safety, refused medical treatment until every soldier under his command was accounted for." His eyes swept over the officers. "And you laughed at his son." The silence deepened, thick and suffocating. Briggs opened his mouth like he might say something, then snapped it shut again under the weight of the general's gaze. "You didn't ask," the general continued, addressing the room now. "You assumed." He didn't need to raise his voice. The shame in the air was louder than any shout could have been. The janitor, Johnson, stood near the entrance now, arms folded across his chest, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't surprised. He had known the truth the moment he saw the boy holding that tag. One of the younger officers near the back of the room came to attention and rendered a sharp, respectful salute toward Marcus. A beat later, another followed. And then another. Briggs stood alone, the only one rooted in place, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The general didn't look at him again. He didn't need to. Instead, he knelt, a high-ranking general with medals shining bright, bringing himself down to eye level with Marcus. He placed a hand over the boy's heart, over the place where the dog tag rested under the thin fabric of his shirt. "Your father didn't just fight battles," he said softly. "He built warriors, he built leaders, and he built you." Marcus blinked rapidly, fighting the sting at the corners of his eyes. The general stood, crisp and sharp, and turned toward the entrance. Through the large glass windows, dark shapes moved. More soldiers, more figures gathering just outside. Reinforcements. Marcus felt it deep in his chest, the same way you feel the rumble of an approaching thunderstorm before you hear the crack of lightning. The story was no longer just his burden to carry. It was about to become something much bigger.
The heavy wooden doors at the back of the station creaked open. Captain Reynolds stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. His expression was grave, carved from years of command, but there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. He didn't ask what was happening. He had been watching the security feed from his office. Every word, every sneer, every cruel chuckle. The captain's gaze swept the room, taking in the frozen faces of his officers, the boy standing tall in front of a decorated general, the dog tag glinting under the harsh lights. He said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch taut and uncomfortable. Then, deliberately, he moved toward Marcus and the general. He stopped before them and extended his hand, not to the general, but to the boy. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority without the need for volume, "I'm Captain Reynolds, and it would be an honor if you would visit our academy one day. Teach our recruits what dignity looks like in the face of disrespect." Marcus looked up, startled, then slowly reached out and shook the captain's hand. His own was small and slightly trembling, but he gripped firmly, the way his father had taught him. Around them, officers shifted, some looking down, others stealing glances toward Briggs, who stood stiff and pale behind the front desk. Captain Reynolds straightened and faced the room. "I've already pulled Sergeant Major King's record," he announced. 22 years of service. Bronze Star with Valor, Distinguished Service Cross, commendations for excellence in leadership and training across 3 continents. His gaze found Briggs, pinning him like a nail to a board. "Officer Briggs," he said, voice cutting through the room like a blade, "my office." "Now." Briggs hesitated, his body frozen in a mix of fear and stubbornness. But under the crushing weight of the room's silence, under the burning gaze of his fellow officers, he finally moved, head lowered, footsteps dragging, as he disappeared down the hallway. The captain turned back to Marcus, lowering himself slightly so he could speak directly to him. "Your father's record," he said, "is not just a list of awards. It's a story of courage, leadership, and sacrifice. But today, son, you wrote a new chapter. A chapter about what it means to carry a legacy with honor." Denise stood a few feet away, tears glistening in her eyes, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth. The general placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, giving a small, approving nod. One by one, the civilians who had laughed earlier rose to their feet, a ripple of awkward but genuine respect moving through the waiting room. The young officer who had saluted earlier stepped forward. "Sir," he said, voice a little shaky, "permission to escort Marcus and his mother home safely." Captain Reynolds nodded. "Granted, and make sure the patrol car has the flags displayed," he added. "He deserves every courtesy we have." Marcus looked up at his mother. She smiled, a tremulous but proud thing, and nodded. As they prepared to leave, the general bent slightly to Marcus's ear. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, "when your father talked about you, he said you had more courage in your little finger than most men have in their whole body." Marcus blinked hard, the weight of those words anchoring him, steadying him. The general straightened again, his uniform catching the light, ribbons and medals gleaming. He turned back to Captain Reynolds. "I'll be contacting Fort Benning," he said. "They'll want to know about this boy." Reynolds nodded in agreement. "Let them know he's already taught a valuable lesson here today," the captain said, and not just to my recruits." The general smiled, a rare, fleeting thing, and placed the folded photograph carefully into Denise's hands. "He should have this," he said simply. Denise clutched it to her chest like a lifeline, nodding through the tears she couldn't hold back anymore. The general turned and walked toward the door, his posture rigid, his boots striking the floor in steady, sure beats. Marcus and his mother followed, flanked by two officers now standing taller than before. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the parking lot in golden light. The general's convoy stood waiting, black SUVs gleaming under the sun. As Marcus climbed into the back seat of the patrol car, he turned for one last look at the station. Through the glass doors, he could see the officers inside, some standing at attention, others simply staring after him. No laughter, no smirks, only a heavy, silent respect that stretched across the concrete and wrapped around him like a shield. The doors closed with a soft click, sealing the moment. And somewhere deep in Marcus's heart, a quiet voice, his father's voice, whispered, "You stood tall, son, and the world stood with you."
Captain Reynolds closed his office door with a sharp click, the sound cutting through the station's heavy silence. Officer Briggs stood stiffly in front of the captain's desk, his face flushed and his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. For a long moment, Reynolds said nothing. He simply stared at the man across from him, letting the silence drag like a slow, grinding blade. "I reviewed the footage," Reynolds said finally, his voice low and steady. "Every word, every look." Briggs opened his mouth, but no sound came out. There was no defense for what he had done. "You mocked a grieving boy," Reynolds continued, his words slicing clean and merciless. "You disrespected a fallen hero. You disgraced this uniform." Briggs dropped his eyes, the weight of the truth suffocating any protest that might have formed. "As of now," Reynolds said, reaching for a file on his desk, "you are removed from desk duty. Effective immediately." Briggs jerked his head up, a flash of panic in his eyes. "You'll be assigned to community outreach," the captain went on. "You'll spend every day working alongside veterans, Gold Star families, and survivors. You will attend every veteran memorial, every military service project. You will listen. You will learn." Briggs opened his mouth again, a protest forming, but Reynolds didn't give him the chance. "And you'll complete mandatory sensitivity and racial bias training at the VA Center downtown," the captain added. "Your pay will be docked. Your record will reflect this." Briggs sagged visibly under the pile of consequences, his mouth snapping shut. "And if you think for 1 second that disrespect like this will ever be tolerated again under my command," Reynolds finished, standing now, looming over the desk, "you are free to turn in your badge today." The room pulsed with the finality of it. Briggs didn't move, couldn't move. The shame was too heavy to carry, but walking away would have been even worse. Reynolds slammed the file shut and pointed to the door. "Dismissed." Briggs turned and shuffled out of the office, shoulders slumped, the weight of what he had lost pressing down on him with every reluctant step. In the lobby, the atmosphere had changed. Marcus and his mother were gone now, safely escorted home under a visible honor guard. But the echoes of what had happened lingered in the walls, in the uneasy shuffling of officers who had laughed too easily, who had looked the other way too quickly. Johnson, the janitor, moved through the lobby with slow, deliberate steps, his mop forgotten for the moment. His eyes met Reynolds's as the captain emerged from his office. A silent exchange passed between them, understanding, approval, and something stronger: respect. The general was still outside, overseeing the loading of vehicles, making sure the boy and his mother were treated with the dignity they deserved. Before he climbed into his SUV, he turned back and nodded once toward the station. It wasn't a farewell, it was a warning. Inside, Reynolds gathered his senior staff. "We failed today," he said bluntly. "We failed a boy who carried more honor in his little hands than some men do in an entire career." No one spoke. No one dared. "Effective immediately," Reynolds continued, "we're implementing a new mandatory training module. Every recruit, every officer, every civilian staff member will complete courses on respect, military service history, and racial sensitivity." He let that settle. "And every academy class from now on," he added, his voice tightening slightly, "will read the service record of Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr. before they graduate. They will know what real leadership looks like, what real sacrifice means." A few officers nodded slowly, grimly. It wasn't enough to fix what had been broken today, but it was a start. Reynolds turned away, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Across the room, the framed wall of honor gleamed under the flickering lights. A spot had already been cleared at the center, waiting for a new photo to take its rightful place. The memory of Marcus, standing tall, clutching that dog tag, burned behind the captain's eyes like a brand. Some mistakes you lived with. Others you worked every single day to make sure they never happened again. This was one of those. Outside, the general's SUV pulled away slowly, disappearing into the golden haze of the late afternoon. Inside, the first threads of real change began to weave through the heart of the station. Quiet, steady, irreversible. A month later, the station lobby looked different. Gone was the cracked paint and faded posters. In their place stood a gleaming memorial, freshly polished and centered under a new set of bright lights. At its heart, framed in dark mahogany, was a photograph. Sergeant Major Marcus King Sr. In the picture, he stood in full uniform, his gaze steady, his posture unwavering. A simple plaque beneath the frame read, "He built warriors. He built leaders. He built a legacy that stands taller than hate." The officers who passed through the lobby each morning slowed their steps now. Some saluted. Some paused just long enough to remember why they wore the badge in the first place. On Veterans Day, the station held a small ceremony. Marcus, dressed in his best shirt and pressed jeans, stood beside his mother. The same dog tag hung proudly from his neck, catching the morning light like a quiet flame. Captain Reynolds stepped forward first, his uniform crisp, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "Today," he said, "we honor not just a soldier, but a standard, a man who lived in the service of others, and a family who reminds us why respect must never be conditional." He turned slightly, facing Marcus directly. "And we remember that true leadership isn't about power. It's about how you treat those who can't fight back." The general was there too, standing tall among a group of veterans, his chest full of medals, but his eyes on the boy, who had stood taller than grown men when it mattered most. When the speeches ended, a chair remained empty at the front of the room. On it hung a single polished dog tag. The inscription beneath it read, "For the quiet ones who taught us how to stand." After the ceremony, officers who had once chuckled behind their desks now greeted Marcus by name. Some knelt to shake his hand. Others simply nodded, a quiet gesture heavier than any words. Marcus stood through it all, quiet and composed, just like his father had taught him. Later that day, as the station emptied and the sun dipped low behind the buildings, Marcus wandered back to the memorial. He stood there alone for a long moment, staring up at the photograph of the man who had shaped his world. In the reflection of the glass, Marcus could see his own face, smaller, younger, but carrying the same spark in his eyes. He reached up and touched the dog tag at his neck. "I miss you, Dad," he whispered. No answer came. None was needed. The silence around him was not empty. It was full. Full of lessons, full of pride, full of the kind of strength that didn't need applause to exist. Behind him, Denise watched quietly, her heart swelling with pride so fierce it hurt. The general joined her, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. "He's going to change the world one day," the general said quietly. Denise smiled through her tears. "He already has," she whispered. Marcus stayed a moment longer, then squared his shoulders and turned away from the memorial. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some legacies weren't written in stone or metals. Some lived in the way you walked into a room, in the way you held your head high when others tried to push you down, in the way a small boy could carry a fallen hero's name into a future where laughter would no longer silence truth. As Marcus walked out of the station, the officers at their desks straightened unconsciously. Conversations lowered. Respect rippled through the room like a rising tide. And as the doors closed behind him, a single, unshakable truth settled over everyone inside. Heroes weren't always the loudest. Sometimes they were the quiet ones. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room carried the greatest weight.